Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Senza Fili Sparring Partners webinar on Dr. Enterprise, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Cellular. In Sparring Partners webinars, we watch two debaters discuss a topic and answer your questions on video without slides. The debaters present their own views and not those of the sponsors. We would like to encourage our audience to participate in the discussion today. Please share your comments and questions through the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. All comments are visible to all participants, so please keep the conversation polite and respectful. Our debaters will do their best to address the questions as they go along and as they are relevant to the topics being discussed. So please do not save your questions to the end. Our sponsor for today's webinar is Corning. Corning is one of the world's leading innovators in material science, with a 168-year track record of life-changing inventions. Corning's industry-leading products include damage-resistant cover glass for mobile devices, precision glass for advanced displays, optical fiber, wireless technologies, and connectivity solutions for state-of-the-art communications networks. I'm Kendra Chamberlain, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Our two debaters are Monica Paolini, Principal at Senza Fili, and Art King, IBM Technologist at Corning. And with that, I will hand it over to Monica.
Hey, hi, everybody, and Kendra, thanks for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and to have Art as my sparring partner today. I've known him for a very long time. And we've been working with different technologies. One thing, the webinar today is on the wireless enterprise. And as I was sort of thinking about what to say, I realized that a lot of the sparring partners that we had, one way or another, focused around the enterprise. And I don't think it's by chance. This is really a market that is finally taking off after a lot of long years of thinking about it. PowerPoints about it, but now I think we're really on the cusp of a major change, which is driven by different aspects that we'll go about. And this is the end of the fall, where I've been to many analyst meetings, and I can tell you that that's really top of the mind for the vendors and also for the operators and the enterprise out there. So I think this is really a timely issue, and there is a reason why it keeps coming up. So with that in mind, Art, we're talking about the enterprise. So let's get started first and say, what is the enterprise for you? Because that right there, it's a complicated concept.
Well, so enterprise is, a loose definition would be something of a company of, say, 100 people or more, where you have an IT staff that's making decisions on behalf of people. So the important thing to think about enterprises is you have a group of IT folks that make a lot of decisions for everybody around communications tools, vendors, mobility choices, what's going to happen indoors in the infrastructure. And those are the people that are very influential and steer the whole organization, from their vantage point. So it's kind of a loose definition.
Yeah, actually, I do like it, because it's always a little bit difficult. Who do you include and who you don't? And so we're talking about wireless in the enterprise, and wireless in the enterprise is nothing new, because everybody owns a phone. Every enterprise has Wi-Fi network. So what is different? And what I would say is that what's changing now, it's not so much that there is wireless in the enterprise, is how deep wireless goes. So it's not just for you to make a few phone calls and to be able to reach people, but it really goes deep down in how you run the enterprise. So it's getting deeper, rather than it's not a new thing. What is your view, Art? And well, sorry, before you go, I just want to encourage all of you to just ask questions before it's too late, because we answer questions as we go along, as it's relevant to the topic we're discussing. So please go ahead, and also feel free to just just have comments. If you like or don't like what we say, just go ahead and say it. So No worries. Okay, Art, sorry.
Okay, so wireless is influential because it's generally engineered, and the user experience is something that people like. And you see in a lot of enterprises where people are choosing to use their mobile device over any offered technology that enterprise IT has brought to them. And years ago, when the iPhone 1 first came out, we kind of looked at each other and we understood how revolutionary it was. But more importantly, we started asking the question of what happens in the enterprise when you get to 100% penetration of these devices. What could you do? What would change? So, we started thinking about what the telecom landscape for internal employee services would look like when you start thinking about what you're offering to the employees today, how they use it. And over time, we've watched as people gradually have abandoned many of the technologies that IT provisions to their desks today and have just switched to mobile. I see it. I see it around me all the time. I see conference rooms where there's a speakerphone, but the person, just for sheer convenience, has tossed their phone in the middle of the table and put it on speaker to use as a conference phone. And it's got very adequate audio quality compared to the speakerphone. So we're seeing a lot of things where people are just reflexively just staying with their mobile device and not using a lot of the offered services that enterprise IT has provisioned in the past.
Yeah, and I'm actually one of the people that when the iPhone came out, I thought, well, what is this thing? Doesn't even have a keyboard. How do you use it? It's not going to go anywhere. And well, I was wrong. But I would say that a lot of those things were really not planned at the beginning. So the iPhone arrived, and then all the other smartphones, and we learned to use it in ways that we were not planning to, in the same way that text was not planned for texting. And it's just that we learned that it was so useful. So as you say, you put your phone there, you just use your phone in all sorts of ways because this has become such a flexible way to get all sorts of things done without having anything special. It's just it just cuts the complexity so much. And so it becomes disruptive, not because it's in some ways, not because it's fancy, but because it's easy. It's the easiness of use that it's causing the disruption more so than I would say anything else.
So let me kind of tell you a story. Mm-hmm. So I was working with an app that had been released internally, and the app had it was for managers to release POs that their employees had generated, and because it was a mobile app, it was engineered to do one thing and do it well. And when we started looking at metrics and how people were using it, we discovered that throughout the corporate buildings, people were not using the 5-stage generic PC interface to go find the PO release button and do it on their laptop or their desktop. They were just sitting there at their desk on their mobile device and approving the POs because it was one click, it was easy, it was obvious on how to use it. And that kind of whole usability philosophy really has driven a migration away from a lot of the enterprise tech.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to ask you a question because you've been, not only you work with the enterprise now, but you have been working within the enterprise in the past. So how do you see the disruption that is coming from wireless right now? What is changing? What these behaviors in the employees, how are they changing the way the enterprise is doing? How is it disrupting the whole enterprise wireless connectivity?
Well, in a lot of cases, what we're seeing is, and this is what I was planning when I was on the buy side as an enterprise person, we were changing how we were going to build and wire office buildings, and we're going to cut millions of dollars of capital expenses out of greenfield construction by eliminating a huge amount of cable plant to the desk, and then we started backing up and looking at the IT services that people were not consuming because they use their mobile for those kind of things like voice. Many people, the desk phone in their office was a place for all the vendors to call and leave voicemails, and you'd check voicemails once a week and potentially not ever actually use your desk phone for anything. So it became kind of an observation of the change in behavior, and starting to understand what people were quietly abandoning within the enterprise. I'm sure we've all sat in meetings together and texted each other and didn't use a corporate IM tool because everyone's got a mobile in their pocket, so you text each other back and forth when you're in a presentation. So a lot of these things, the utility of the tool and the fact that it's always in your pocket, it's a very useful transformation. And as an IT person, things have to scale. And the operators, they scale up to 130, 140 million people on one network. A large enterprise at 50 or 60,000 people is that's like one neighborhood in like Los Angeles or something, compared to what the scale of the operators networks.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, before we go too far, why don't we start with the first poll? Kendra, do you want to get started with that?
Yes. Our first poll: who will support future enterprise cellular needs? Mobile operators, managed service providers, system integrators, or will be internal to enterprise?
And so as we're waiting, I'm still going to tell you, do ask questions and put comments. You guys are shy today. And actually, the way I call my fixed line is not attached to a phone anymore, because I never answer the phone anyway. I call it the dev null /dev /null. That's the way I call it, because that's where I do, when I do not want to be reached, I use my fixed phone line.
Yeah, I live in a rural area where you have to have a landline combined with internet service. You can't just get internet service, and the landline just is quietly and permanently asleep with no one ever checking it.
They couldn't even install it in my place. So that's really why I really do not have fixed. Anyway, I think there's still people voting.
Yeah.
Just give it a little bit. So what we're moving on now is to talk about, okay, so wireless is important for the enterprise. Now the question is how to do it. We have the first question, and we're going to get to that after we get the results of the poll. Kendra, do you want to go over the results?
Yeah, all right. So we have a little bit of a mixed bag. 35% said managed service providers, 30% said internal to enterprise, 26% said mobile operators, and 9% system integrators.
Art, is that what you were expecting?
I was expecting more in the way of mobile operators, but the managed service providers is a great selection, and I say that because Wi-Fi and cellular are radically different, and at the end of the day, you really want to gear up to actually run mobile infrastructure inside your enterprise, or do you want an MSP to just provide it as a kind of a clean monthly transaction with them handling the operations? So, I see internal to enterprise being important if you're going to start doing like manufacturing, and you're going to do a huge amount of things that are mission critical and close to the heartbeat of the business. IT is going to have to run it because you're responsible for SLAs and availability, and you can't have a main part of your operation down and no one to talk to as far as getting help, because you're contracted to someone on the outside world. So I see, enterprise is going to run anything that's mission critical.
Yeah, actually, as I was looking at the results, I would say that having managed service providers does not mean that the mobile operators are not included. And I think that we're going to see a lot of situations where the physical build out, the day-to-day managing on the network might be a managed service provider, but the managed service provider works with the operators. And I think that there is a value to that, especially when you have a multi-branch, a multi-location type of business, where a lot of the applications, a lot of the traffic stays local, but some of it, and an important part of it, needs to go across the cloud. And,
Right.
and then you have employees working from home. So in that part, the operators are going to be important. The question, though, is that the role of the operators might change and evolve in that context, because some operators are trying to go and build infrastructure and run it. And the question is, will they succeed or not? And I think that's debatable.
Yeah, well, within the context of, and I'll start chatting a little bit about Jerry's question about private LTE.
Mm-hmm.
We are seeing a lot of interest in private LTE because you can bring up LTE and still have a connection to the operators. It requires a dual SIM phone, but I've seen this in use, with my own two eyes, so I know it's real, where one SIM opens the door onto the enterprise LTE network, and then the operator SIM actually phones home using Wi-Fi interconnect procedures to connect out to the core network. So we're already seeing that enterprises can light LTE themselves without a lot of intervention and still connect to the home network. And assuming that the network is installed correctly and is built correctly for handovers and when you're roaming and stuff on LTE internally, you're in pretty good shape. Just with the dual SIM phone. So we're seeing that that private LTE could be offered by the operators. It could be offered by managed service providers, or it could be built by the enterprises. And the operator community is always searching for revenue, and they have a great back-end infrastructure to manage SIMs, KPIs, SLAs, the whole 9 yards on the back end. So they have a lot of the raw material necessary to offer private LTE, but in what shape or form that's going to happen, it's yet to be determined.
Yeah, I completely agree with you in the sense that, yeah, the operators have all they need. The question is that sometimes the enterprise, I think that it's not the expertise, that it's what is the challenge for the operators is the ability to get the trust, to be cost effective, to get the trust of the enterprise. And by trust, I don't mean in terms of the security part, but the enterprise, whenever I talk to the enterprise, they want to have control over the network. They want to have the network do exactly what they want it to do. They want to know what, where things are. And so, and operators are also they have a little bit of a control freak syndrome, because they're used to do this. They want to know what the network is doing. So I think that a lot of time you see some tension there in terms of, can the enterprise control if an operator is involved? And I think that that's going to be a major issue. And that's why I think some enterprises might prefer to have a third party to run their networks, so that they have better sense, better control, and pay for it too.
Yeah, well, and to that point, Mark, hello, Mark Grayson, how are you? So he asks a very critical question and comment here about SLA penalties. So the things that happen with managed providers, I don't know personally, what happens in the operator community, whether or not the sales force and the people involved in network engineering will sign up to penalties, will sign up to SLAs. And it may be that there's certain markets and certain things where there's going to be opting out of opportunities because of the business risk of jumping in, or the inability to commit to an SLA that has teeth in it, that bites. Because, you know, if you're supporting a production line and it's down, and somehow you've got best effort, consumer grade support, the internal decision maker within the enterprise that made that decision is in pretty big trouble, because your manufacturing is halted because you made a drastic contractual error when you committed.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be is actually going to be one of the sort of disruptive features in terms of not only how we build networks, but how we evaluate it. How do you treat reliability? How do you measure it? Because the kind of KPIs that you have for a public network are going to be somewhat different. So there is clearly some overlap. But I think that for the enterprise, you might have a different way to qualify. The SLAs that might be structured differently. So that's going to require some work on everybody's part.
Yeah, well, and on some of the private LTE, the providers, there's also the emergence of providers that are already wireless operators and have roaming agreements with like the major carriers in the U.S. and they have the ability to broadcast their own PLMN and have the people be able to roam on and off the network at some point. So that would also be very useful, especially for single SIM phones, to have roaming infrastructure set up like that. The one caution that we should all put out there when we think about paying for these kinds of things is that the enterprise is going to pay the freight for these things. There's no sense in the industry that the operators are going to pay for or pay a roaming charge to get onto the network for convenience. It appears that the enterprise is either going to pick it up as a fixed cost, like a monthly charge for the managed service infrastructure or something like that, to kind of make sure that the MSP gets ROI on the hardware investment and the OpEx to run the infrastructure on behalf of the enterprise.
No, absolutely. And in fact, this goes to the question of who's going to pay for it. And I think that the enterprise has to pay for it, because that's the only way they can have the control they need. Also because it's cheaper for the enterprise to build it. And in many cases, it might be just an extension of what they already have, Wi-Fi, SCADA, or whatever enterprise network they have, and so that makes sense. And that sort of reminded me of what they're doing in the UK, which I think it's interesting in terms of how you structure all the payments and revenues, roaming, and all of that. Yeah. And so in the UK now they have a new framework that so there are some bands that are for the enterprise, not for the enterprise. They're just assigned on a local basis, so the enterprise of wireless ISPs or communities can use it. But then they have another one where a mobile operator can have another user use their spectrum, and the idea there is that you might have a rural community, you might have an enterprise, an in-building kind of coverage, and the operator is not using that spectrum and allows somebody else to use it. And in exchange, they can give access to their own subscribers. And I think that this is an example, and we're going to see many more of that, where it's not who is going to pay, pay roaming charges or whatever. There are different type of arrangements by which you realize that it's important to provide, for instance, in-building coverage, but an operator is not willing to pay for it, and they're not going to really pay for roaming, and it's not, it shouldn't really matter.
Right. I hear you, Kitty. Yeah, and that's certainly true. And there's the ability to light essentially spectrum that hasn't been lit by the operator that licenses spectrum from the government hasn't been regulatory mandated yet in the U.S. So you really that's not something that's hit here so far. But in many office buildings, you'll find that there's a distinct lack of signal in many places within office buildings. So
Yeah,
it's,
absolutely.
it can be a problem, but, the operators have to address it somehow with their approved technology at this moment in time until something happens where spectrum can be shared or lit up by a third party and interconnected into the carrier's, main core network or whatever.
Yeah, and then then if you start having a lot of private networks, as you mentioned before, we're gonna start having the issue of how you authenticate to those networks, because you're not gonna have a different phone for when you get to work. So the multi-SIM, I think, is going to be really crucial in pushing things forward, because we used to have the business phone and the personal phone. It's just we're not getting there. How important do you think is going to be the dual SIM, or do you see other forms of authentication, especially for IoT devices?
Well, so eSIMs look like they're going to take off for IoT, but even in the enterprise space, in closed geographic areas where you're going to provide devices that are going to stay there and be on that private infrastructure, Dan brought up a good point here, that you can essentially leverage your corporate dial plan for your PBX infrastructure and distribute phone numbers out to the mobile devices and use the native dialer and run against the dial plan of your own corporation. As long as you don't expect to take those mobiles off that private network and anywhere else, it's certainly feasible to actually use your incumbent enterprise infrastructure and essentially remove the corporate handsets and integrate into the native voice capabilities of the mobile devices themselves. Lost your audio.
Sorry, I was unmuted. So yeah, and I guess that you might have a lot of devices which are specifically enterprises. So in some cases you might have the enterprise handset or specific devices, but then you can use your phone as well. And I guess that goes with the flexibility with the wireless, and it can be the private LTE or private 5G is going to be also tied with the local Wi-Fi that the enterprise will continue to have. So actually, Art, what's your view on the coexistence with Wi-Fi? This is an area where there's a lot of people have very different views on how is Wi-Fi and private LTE work in the enterprise.
They're complementary. I mean, anybody who thinks that Wi-Fi is going to be replaced, they're not rational. So there's a huge amount of laptops and provision devices connected to Wi-Fi, and it does its job every day. And it's the enterprise knows how to run it, and it doesn't have any kind of external costs associated with it like a mobile device might have on a public network. So there's a lot of advantages to Wi-Fi, and bringing in private LTE is because you have a business need that requires the characteristics of LTE and in the future 5G. You need the fair access to scheduled MAC layer. You need the voice services. You want to enable mobile devices to run a lot of the native interfaces. For a lot of those things, it's just practical to go ahead and run it on private LTE infrastructure instead of trying to Wi-Fi.
No, absolutely. It's a little bit. Now, since we're talking about different technologies, there is a question from Vladan about millimeter wave in the enterprise, and I'm personally I'm a big believer in building millimeter wave, because you have huge amounts of spectrum, and the bad propagation is an advantage in the sense that you can use that spectrum locally and have very good control. So for things like robotic control, which is what the question mentions, I think that's a huge opportunity there. Although oftentimes you might not need necessarily the high bandwidth that you have. So in some cases it might be good, in some cases it's not necessary. But I think it's a huge opportunity, and I think that we should think of the enterprise networks not as just one technology. So even if you look, for instance, at CBRS, for an enterprise, I don't think that the enterprises will just do CBRS, period. They're going to have, at least they're going to have Wi-Fi, and then they're going to have different bands. And then the question becomes, how do you integrate them? Rather than it's not who is the winner and is going to kill all the other ones, it's how you integrate them all.
Yeah, a lot of the 3GPP technologies, the cellular technologies, are pretty much integrated together kind of de facto by the standards that are created. It's more, how does it all kind of plug into existing enterprise infrastructure, and potentially what enterprise infrastructure can you throw overboard in the process of this transition. So it's really it's not so much anything other than how does it fit inside the ecosystem. And enterprises, and this circles back on that comment around things that'll be tough for the mobile operators to do, because every enterprise is its own custom configuration. There's no such thing as a template for enterprises. Everyone builds their networks a different way. They've all sorts of different technologies, different authentication methods. So it's something it's a very high touch universe, and to fit in the operators into something that's where every customer is a one-off from their perspective. It's a tough challenge, and it requires almost like special groups of people that can bridge the gap between the world of the scalable template and the custom configuration that every enterprise actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I saw there is another question that it's on spectrum. So I mentioned the UK, but the coin also mentions countries like Holland and Germany, where there is spectrum available for enterprise networks. And I think that that's emerging is going to be really important, because in those cases, so Germany, Netherlands, and the UK, there is a different approach to spectrum. So rather than assigning a license that it's good for what is supposed to be, for what it's meant to be a public network that covers the whole country, it's going the other direction and allocate spectrum on a local basis. So basically, whoever needs the spectrum has control over the location, the real estate, or wants to deploy there, if it's like something like a wireless ISP, they can get the spectrum. That makes spectrum much more affordable, and increases the potential for spectral reuse, because you get it for your own factory, enterprise, rural area, whatever it is, and you deploy there. So I think that this is really, this is going to be a game changer. Because also you don't need huge amount of spectrum for this kind of rollouts. And like in the US, the idea is that use it or lose it. So first, so if you apply, you get it. If you use it, you can keep it forever. It's a perpetual license. If you don't use it, they'll give it to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
So Art, how do you think that, is that going to change? How important is that? And then obviously you have CBRS in the US as well.
The Wi-Fi model of infinite spectral reuse is what CBRS is attempting to emulate, and it's nice because you keep a lot of low power devices indoors, and you can service a lot of real estate without having spectrum collide. When the outdoor CBRS starts being deployed, where you have 50-watt radios and stuff, I don't know what the landscape looks like, but the SaaS environment that's supposed to arbitrate and manage allocation of spectrum based on geographic location, in theory, is supposed to handle a lot of those things. And Dan asked a question here about the feature sets and services in private LTE. A lot of the vendors that are involved in private LTE are very interested in listening to the buyer and working backwards through a group called the WIN Forum that develops most of the standards around that the CBRS is being deployed under. And there's quite a bit of activity out there on prioritizing and actually grabbing features that people want to have available to them on the enterprise side. Yeah, so there's enterprise companies that are selling CBRS, and really, they're bringing the customer needs and the customer visions back in, because right now on the early stages of private LTE, there's some very big corporates that want to adopt this and see a need for it inside many chunks of their operations, and because of that, they have a lot of attention when they bring a feature request from a global company back to the WIN Forum.
Yeah, actually, and so this is part of a report that I'm working on. So I'm doing some research on CBRS, and in the report, actually, art is going to be part of it. I've been looking, what are the first deployments of CBRS, and I was talking to somebody yesterday about this as well. And it's interesting because if you look at what people are doing, it's actually pretty simple initially. So, we all are familiar with the autonomous driving, AR, VR, all the kind of really fancy use cases that work very well on slides. But what on day one people are doing is, things like voice, being able to pay, being able to park, making sure that all the building is okay, webcams and things like that. So I think that we should clearly look at the sort of like the more advanced applications, but also keep in mind that at the very beginning, and it's a good thing, I think, that we're going to be seeing sort of very basic bread and butter type of applications, which have the advantage of proving the usefulness and validity. And so, for instance, I saw somebody's bill that is asking about voice, and I think that voice is kind of old school, but we still need it, and so this is going to be a good ground to sort of build the foundation in terms of applications for what we're going to see next. So, you talk to the enterprises every day. So, what do you hear from them?
We're hearing things like people that the one problem that a lot of people are trying to solve, paradoxically, is still a cost-effective way to get mobile broadband to all the employees that are howling for service indoors. I mean, we're not shooting rockets to the moon here. There's quite a few people that still have the unmet need of just basic service, and there's visionary people that are looking at how do I throw a lot of my IT infrastructure overboard and adopt mobile to successfully do that. And we see conversations going on around how does the operator become an authentication broker back to, say, the enterprise Active Directory infrastructure, so that a lot of the provisioning and a lot of the operations are automated and don't have a provisioning burden associated with them. So there's work going on in orchestration and automation to think the problem through, so that you can have a connection to your chosen carrier or carriers, and from there, an employee joining the organization and connecting their mobile in is a trivial exercise of a self-provisioning at a portal that wouldn't require IT to do any work. So it's really any kind of automation to take the workload off of the IT organization is also looked at as really valuable.
Absolutely, and then also things like eventually slicing will allow to have different services to coexist. So depending on what the enterprise needs to do and what are the needs, they can do it. Now, I realize that Bill's question is about voice over Wi-Fi. And do you want to comment on the voice aspects? I know you've been doing a lot of work on that part.
So the early part of voice over Wi-Fi, we had it worked at home, but it didn't work at at work. And it was a couple of different things that were happening. Number one, the enterprise's choice of authentication might have had problems with the mobile device. So as you moved around, you would end up dropping calls. Just because when you left one AP, the call didn't hand over fast enough, so you ended up dropping the call. And we also saw that they were using IPsec NAT-T tunnels to connect to the core network, and most security organizations don't let you originate a NAT-T tunnel from inside an enterprise because it can be used for exfiltration of stolen data and that kind of thing. So it becomes a security risk. And I haven't looked at it in a year or so, and I don't know if the way they connect to the core has changed. But the early parts of it, it was more or less, it was call drops and quality issues that people were complaining about and gave up on it. And what we found was IT organizations, when we did voice over the customer conversations with IT guys, they said, we're not going to tell anyone it's official because we don't want to support it, because we don't have the bandwidth to do our job today, and we can't double the amount of devices connected on the network. So they were just looking at the perfect storm of doubling the devices on the network and having no head count to do it. And then they said that, if people are smart enough to do it on their own and can do it, that means that they're not going to bother us. But everybody else, we don't want them to know. And it was more a practical response to the lack of staffing, because anytime you bring a service active in an enterprise, you have to do support procedures, help desk procedures, call flows. Is it end user computing that's going to maintain the devices? How does a network group fit in when it can't traverse the firewall? So there's a whole kind of dance of all these employees and all these different silos within IT that have to be involved in it when you take something live in a production way. And we just found that the IT organizations were going, it may save the money, and it may provide connectivity in these dead areas where there's no cellular, but oh my God, the impact on the IT organization if we actually do this it could be huge. So we saw people avoiding it more just because of fear of how bad it could get from an operations perspective more than anything else.
Okay, why don't we move to the second poll? Kendra, do you want to?
Yes. Okay, enterprise culture. Are the newly onboarded college graduates, are they satisfied by the enterprise tech they are given? Yes, no, or don't know?
Okay, so as we wait for it, I just wanted to answer quickly to one question from Jerry about the definition of operators and managed service providers. So an operator can act as a managed service provider. Here, what we in the previous poll, what we called a mobile operator is a mobile operator that acts as a managed service provider, and the other ones would be other companies like Extenet or Mobility or tower companies that offer it as a service.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And so, so now we're switching to talk about the culture in the enterprise and start talking more about business models and going beyond the technology. And see if we have any more questions. Yeah, so we have a comment on voice over Wi-Fi that supports only 25 to 34 calls for AP. Yes.
Yeah. One comment on millimeter wave on an earlier question.
Mm-hmm.
So just for sake of definition, millimeter wave is spectrum 24 gigahertz and higher. And it tends to be a line of sight spectrum where you have potential that you have to have a lot more radios than you do with the lower frequencies that can penetrate walls and and radiate through walls. There's models that show that millimeter wave signals will bounce off walls and provide blanket coverage. Just not the same as a lower frequency cell where it goes through the walls, but you'll be able to bounce things around walls and stuff and actually provide fairly full coverage. We'll see what it looks like when the real world hits. But from the perspective of millimeter wave, there's a certain amount of unknowns with it, and there's also unknowns around the handset where the antennas are. If you recall that, I forget, maybe it was the iPhone 4, the iPhone 5, where the antennas were where your hands were. So when you held it, you degraded the signal pretty dramatically. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of thought going into millimeter wave and how it's going to be fit in the form factor of the phone and actually work in production service.
Yeah, actually, I saw a demo of millimeter wave at Qualcomm for indoor connectivity. They were looking at exactly this kind of like bouncing of the signal, and I think that it's very interesting and very promising. But at the same time, if you are an enterprise, the model of just like you put a Wi-Fi access point wherever you need it, so you might need to do a little bit more of RF planning. Although, and it's actually true that even for Wi-Fi, if you want to have good coverage, you need to do RF planning. There's no way around it. But it is something that you can exploit it. It's just that it's not part of the specs of the product because it's so dependent on whatever building, infrastructure, materials, and all that you use. But clearly, there's a huge opportunity, even for outdoor coverage with millimeter wave. You can have a lot of bouncing that helps.
Yeah, on the factory use case that was posed in the question, if the factory floors are pretty wide open and have a lot of just open space for transmission, you'll probably get away with it with quite a few less radios than you'd have maybe in an enterprise environment where you have a lot of walls and stuff on a carpeted floor type universe.
Absolutely. Although I guess the issue there, if you have a lot of mobility, that might be, but then again, it's not really a big deal because you might be able to move things around because the networks are, much more flexible. Okay, why don't we look at the results of the poll?
Okay, the results are in. 43% said they don't know, 33% say no, and 24% said yes.
Okay, the don't know always wins. And anyway, but I think that might sort of be reflective of the exactly the problem that we're sort of, or the potential issue that we're trying to talk about is how do we go and introduce change in a way that it might be disruptive, but also accepted and embraced. Because if you're too disruptive, and people might just refuse to use it, and then you're not doing very well. Is there such a risk?
Well, we're involved in a generational change here with people that have been digital on mobile all their lives and haven't used a lot of the enterprise services, and there's a lot of questioning of, why do I have this when I've got my mobile? And that's also a CFO kind of level question. If you've got a whole lot of technology that's being purchased but not used by people, perhaps you should change. And it might be like what happened with Unix back in the day when all of us that used Unix in college got promoted to leadership levels and threw all the mini computers out the door in a couple of years. So I don't know if it takes a changing of the guard to actually change the thinking, or whether there's people looking at it right now saying, how do I maybe integrate the mobile voice services in with my devices and not not buy and provision a phone, not buy a licensed slot for voice or on the PBX for these people who are never at their desk. So, for all the knowledge workers that aren't desk bound, there's a lot of personal services that are provisioned to them that we could probably divest of, and if there was a clean way that was painless to integrate the mobile's native infrastructure into the enterprise backend.
Now, this is a question that, so when you think about the enterprise as a market, usually I think that it requires a change across the value chain. So vendors have to change, and some are better than others. And well, what I mean by that is that different vendors have different strategies on that. Mobile operators need to think about the enterprise in a different way, because traditionally they've served the enterprise in the sense of having employees with handsets, but not working directly with the enterprise in developing services for the enterprise. But then the enterprise have to do a lot of the work. Do you think that the enterprise have the right people right now, or the right organization, the right culture to introduce the change? Because somebody, and whenever you work with the enterprise, you typically find that somebody in there really knows where to go, how to go there. They really have the clear vision. And then when they try to introduce things, there is a lot of resistance. There is a lot of attraction. So even though they might be on the right track, do they have the support system? Do you have the right environment to move forward? Or is this slowing down things?
So in my experience, driving change in the enterprise, it's like farming. You have to wander around and plant seeds and show people stuff and get them to buy in over time. It's proof of concepts. It's a lot of ditch digging to get people to buy into the change and to really, embrace it and say, let's do this. And then the other thing that holds you back is, your budget cycle. So, if you can do these kinds of things incrementally, where you're going to do controlled experiments and say the architecture group within, a large multinational says, we're gonna do everything on mobile. We're gonna divest of all these fixed services that we have on our desk, and we're gonna have laptop and mobile, and we're gonna be on Wi-Fi, and we're gonna be on cellular, and we're never gonna be wired again. That's frankly where everyone's going, and the big question is as you move forward, what do you do to migrate the organization? Who's going to retain, fixed services because of their role? Executives, lawyers, contact centers, they're all going to continue to be wired because the role requires it, as is executive admins and people that are handling the main switchboard for the organization. But there's a huge amount of people out there that they don't need anything except their mobile. And how do you bring that mobile cleanly into the enterprise, either on private LTE infrastructure or public cellular? Just how do they get connectivity to get kind of so they have signal everywhere? Because without signal everywhere, it's hard to make these foundational changes.
Yeah. And I guess once you have the coverage, it might be a situation where it's both driven by the employees that see the utility, the ease of use of mobile devices, wireless devices, and the IT that is trying to push it because it's an easier way for them to manage the services. But as you say, everything has to be gradual. You want to have a gradual introduction. So it's the planting of the seed that matters. Now, when you plant the seeds, what is the main driver there? Is it a better ROI, better security, convenience? I mean, and I guess you're not allowed to say all of the above. How do you see those things to rank?
Unfortunately, it's money. Mm-hmm. You have to show how people are going to save money. You're going to cut maintenance costs. You're going to, reduce, CapEx for new employees. So it's really, budgeting in an enterprise is a blood sport where you're trying to get money to do something. Software projects always have priority over infrastructure. So you have to provide a pretty compelling story around how you're going to change things and what the long-term benefits to the corporation will be. So it's really, it's about money. And then secondarily, it's about improving the experience of the employees and potentially attracting and retaining younger workers, because if you have an old school environment, maybe it won't be attractive to younger workers. And with baby boomers retiring at 10,000 per day right now, it's going to be long-term, it's going to be a very fierce competition to go after the younger workers. And you're going to want to have an environment that's, the technologically progressive that they'd like to be in, and that they would tell their friends about, I work here, and, it's a awesome compute environment. Frankly, when it comes to making money, I'm not sure, how that rises as far as just a paycheck, but there's a significant amount of tech people that have choices of where to work, and the working environment could make a difference in whether or not you attract and retain this type of talent long term.
Yeah, and in fact, it's not even. I think it's really a working environment. It's not even seen as the IT or computation. That's just part of what you do. So the distinction between work, environment, life, and connectivity tends to kind of disappear. It's not like you're not connected. You have to be connected, and that's part of life, and the experience. So it's all together. Now, when you talk about cost savings, where are those really coming from? Because oftentimes when we tend to stick so close to the network, so we like, how much do you save in the access, in the core, here and there. But if you look at, I think that we really need to look at the sort of higher picture, sort of stand out a bit and say, okay, where are we the major cost savings? Is it equipment, operations, ability to retain people, the ability of your employees to do what they're supposed to do, IoT-driven type of cost savings? Where are the savings coming from, you think?
Well, there's a lot of potential savings in network infrastructure, and even something as humble as a cable. When we used to build out cubicles, you'd build out 4 Cat5 cables. Each cable is $325 a pull. So you end up, if you go from 4 to 1, you're going to cut $1,000 per cubicle out of your construction costs. So there's a lot of little benefits in greenfield construction. I've seen places where they've done so much in the way of wireless that a lot of their core switches that they have in the IDF closets, they're being used as power supplies for LED lights in the ceiling. So as they switch over to LED lights, they're redeploying the Ethernet ports on their switches over to power the light bars in the ceiling. So there's, when you start getting to PBXs, instant messaging, and the annual maintenance costs that follow along with a lot of the different software and hardware products that you would have people using, if they were using native services on the mobile and just were integrated in the corporation, the annual cost for that would go away, and the CapEx cost, either for a refresh or for a new building, a lot of those costs would disappear. We see the potential that everything could be wireless. I mean, imagine that you have a charging pad at your cubicle that you set your laptop on, and up in the ceiling you've got terabits of Wi-Fi and terabits of cellular capacity available to the devices, so that you have the high performance environment that you would get on wired, but without all the OpEx of cabling. My telecom group, when we moved 60% of our people per year on a campus of 12,000 people, and it was $100 per person for each move. So those numbers stacked up real fast every year. And, you start pulling that kind of costs out of just, OpEx for facilities, for moves, adds, and changes, you're really counting on some big savings. So, and those are the kinds of things you just take up to your CFO as, part of the storytelling to get your budget dollars.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And there is it's like the whole way you think of the workspace, I guess, in the enterprise when that wireless allows. And in fact, maybe 6G should be wireless electricity, because if we had wireless electricity, then that would be so much better, because it would really increase the mobility part. I think we're over the hour, so I have to hand it back to Kendra. Art, thanks a lot for talking to us.
Thank you, Monica.
Okay, guys, thank you so much. That concludes our webinar for today. Let's see if I can get the screen to share. Okay. So thank you again to our audience. This webinar will be available on demand at senzafili.com, and we will email instructions to the participants shortly to access the on-demand webinar. And thanks again to Corning for sponsoring today's webinar. We have an upcoming webinar on December 17th at 11 a.m. Eastern, and that's Hits and Misses of 2019 with Chris Nickel of Nickel Associates and Monica Paolini. And you can register for that at senzafili.com. Thanks again, and we will conclude the webinar. See you at future events.